The Montana sun in August offered no mercy. It beat down on the cracked earth, baked the rock, and bleached the very life from the sky. It was a sky that held no promises and told no lies. Down below, in the silence of that unforgiving heat, Elias Thorne believed in the same principles. He was a man carved from the rock and dust of the territory itself, a solitary figure whose only companions were the wind and the weight of a past he never spoke of. From his vantage point on a stony ridge, he watched the world with the detached patience of a hawk, a man who wasn't looking for trouble, but who recognized it instantly when he saw it. And on this day, trouble had found its way into his valley. His eyes, narrowed against the glare, caught movement in the dry gulch below. It wasn't the natural scuttling of a lizard or the slow amble of a lost calf. This was the ugly, jagged rhythm of human cruelty. A man, burly and coarse, was dragging a girl by her long, dark hair. His name was Jedediah Cain, though Elias didn't know it then. To Elias, he was just a stain on the landscape, a walking violation of the unwritten law of the wilderness. Cain's left hand was tangled brutally in the girl's hair, yanking her forward over the sharp rocks with each lumbering step. His right hand held a Colt revolver, held loosely but with an air of absolute ownership. He was a man taking what he believed was his. The girl, Ilara Vance, was a whisper of a thing, lost inside a torn and filthy dress. She fought with the desperate, failing energy of a trapped bird. Her bare feet scraped and bled on the stone. Her face was a mask of terror and pain, eyes swollen nearly shut, a dark line of dried blood crusting a split lip. Each time she stumbled, he would haul her back to her feet by her scalp, his grunts of effort mixing with her stifled sobs. It was a scene from the deepest parts of hell, played out under the indifferent blue sky. Elias Thorne was not a lawman. He wasn't a preacher. He was not a man who meddled in the affairs of others. He had come to these mountains to be left alone, to build a wall of silence and solitude between himself and the world that had wronged him. But there were lines. Lines that, once crossed in his presence, demanded a response. And this was a chasm. He didn't think about the consequences. He didn't weigh the odds or consider who the man might be or who his friends were. In the cold, quiet calculus of his soul, the equation was simple. A predator was hurting the weak. The equation had only one answer. There was no thought, no hesitation. There was only the seeing, and then the doing. He spurred his horse, a powerful roan that knew its master's intent without a command. They didn't just descend the ridge, they fell down its face in a controlled avalanche of dust and stone. The thunder of hooves was the only warning Jedediah Cain received. He turned, his face a snarl of confusion and rage, trying to bring his own weapon to bear. He was too slow. Elias was already upon him, a spectre of righteous fury. His own Colt seemed to leap into his hand, an extension of his will. The setting sun glinted off the barrel for a fraction of a second, the last thing Jedediah Cain would ever see. A single, deafening crack echoed off the canyon walls, scattering birds for a mile in every direction. The bullet struck Cain square in the chest. The force of it threw him backward, his grip on the girl's hair finally broken. He crumpled like a burlap sack filled with sand, his gun tumbling from his lifeless fingers and clattering onto the rocks. The dust settled around him in a slow, silent shroud. The sudden silence was more profound than the gunshot. Ilara Vance fell to the ground, not fainting, but collapsing from the sheer, soul-deep exhaustion of her ordeal. She curled into a ball, her body racked with tremors, her mind unable to process the shift from brutal violence to absolute stillness. Elias dismounted, his movements now slow and deliberate. The fire in his eyes had cooled to embers of grim resolve. He walked toward her, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He was a big man, and his shadow fell over her. She flinched, scrambling backward like a wounded animal, her one good eye wide with a new kind of fear. She had traded one monster for another, but Elias stopped. He sheathed his Colt, the sound of leather on steel a final definitive punctuation mark. He held his hands out, open and empty, showing her he meant no further harm. He didn't speak. Words were useless here. They were the tools of a world that had failed her, the currency of men who made promises and broke them. Instead, he offered silence. He offered the end of her suffering. He knelt, slowly, and reached not for her, but for the canteen on his belt. He uncorked it and held it out. For a long moment she just stared, her breath coming in ragged hitches. Then, with a shaking hand that seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, she reached for it. He had ended one hell for her. A public spectacle of pain and degradation. But as he helped her to her feet and lifted her gently onto his horse, Elias Thorne knew, with the cold certainty of a mountain winter, that he might have just dragged them both into another. A different kind of hell, one that had followed him his entire life and had now, finally, caught up. If you're enjoying this story, comment number 1 down below and hit that subscribe button. Help us get to 1,000 subscribers and encourage us to create more thrilling Wild West tales just like this one. Now, let's find out what happens when a killer with a conscience brings a broken stranger into his isolated world. The ride back to the cabin was a journey through a world of ghosts. The sun bled out behind the western peaks, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, the colors of a fresh bruise. Elias rode with a grim set to his jaw, Ilara a dead weight in front of him, her head resting against his chest, not out of trust, but from sheer exhaustion. Every hoofbeat was a dull thud marking time in this new, unwanted chapter of his life. He could feel the fine tremors that still racked her body, the ghost of her terror. He had built his life on the principle of non-interference. He had traded the chaos of the world for the predictable silence of the mountains. In a single, explosive moment of righteous anger, he had shattered that peace. He had invited the world, in its most brutal form, right back into his quiet existence. The ghost of Jedediah Kane rode with them, a third passenger whose presence was as cold and heavy as the coming night. His cabin was not a home. It was a shelter, a fortress. Tucked into a fold of the mountain and flanked by towering pines, it was more wood and stone than warmth and comfort. It was a place designed for one man and his memories. As they approached, the familiar silhouette looked different, foreign. It was no longer just his refuge. It was now a hospital, a hiding place, a potential tomb for them both. He dismounted, the leather of his saddle creaking in the twilight stillness, and gently lifted her down. She was lighter than he expected, as if the hardship had hollowed her out, leaving only a fragile shell. She didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the dark, imposing shape of the cabin door, as if weighing one prison against another. Inside, the single room was cloaked in shadow, smelling of pine smoke, old leather, and solitude. Elias moved with an economy born of long practice, lighting a lantern. The golden glow pushed back the darkness but seemed only to magnify the tension. It illuminated the starkness of his life. A narrow cot, a rough-hewn table with one chair, a stone fireplace, and shelves holding the bare necessities. There was no room for a second person here, no space for the complexities of another human life. He guided her to the cot, the only soft place in the entire structure. She sank onto it, pulling a worn wool blanket around herself, creating a barrier between them. For 2 days, silence was the primary occupant of the cabin. It was a thick, breathing silence, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind outside, and the careful sounds of Elias moving about his life. He tended to her wounds with a clumsy gentleness that was at odds with his rugged appearance. His large, calloused hands, accustomed to the heft of an axe and the recoil of a rifle, were surprisingly steady as he cleaned the cuts on her face and feet with warm water and carbolic soap. She bore it all with a stillness that was more terrifying than tears. She never spoke. She barely ate the stew he would leave by her bedside. Her eyes, when they were open, were vacant, staring at a point on the far wall, replaying a horror he could only imagine. Elias found himself pacing. He was a man who thrived on stillness, and now his own cabin felt like a cage. Her presence was a constant, unspoken accusation, not from her, but from himself. He had killed a man. It was a justified act, a righteous one even, but the taking of a life always leaves a mark on the soul. And now the evidence of that act was sleeping in his bed. He would find himself staring at her, this broken piece of humanity he had claimed from the wilderness, and a war would rage inside him. The instinct to protect her was a powerful, primal thing. He saw not just a woman, but a symbol of every injustice he had ever witnessed. But behind that instinct was a colder, more practical fear. She was trouble. Trouble had a way of multiplying. Jedediah Cain wasn't a man who would exist in a vacuum. Men like that had brothers or cousins or friends who would come looking. They would follow a trail of vengeance that now led directly to his door. He had spent years erasing his own trail, and in one afternoon he had created a new one, bright and clear for anyone to follow. He was a man who had made his peace with being alone. Now the quiet rhythms of his life were utterly broken. He couldn't clean his rifle without feeling her eyes on him, wondering if he was the same as the man who had hurt her. He couldn't step outside to chop wood without a nagging worry that she might try to run, disappearing back into the wilderness where she would surely perish. The solitude he had cultivated as a shield now felt like a liability. How could one man defend this place against a determined threat? His fortress felt terribly fragile. For Elara, the cabin was a place of profound confusion. She had been saved by violence. Her rescuer was a killer, a man of terrifying capability. Yet, he had shown her a kindness she hadn't known in years. He moved with a quiet intensity, his face a mask she couldn't read. She would watch him from under the edge of the blanket, tracking his every movement. She saw the way he stoked the fire, his motions precise and unhurried. She saw him cleaning his weapons, a ritual performed with the focus of a priest. She saw him stand by the window for long stretches, staring out at the mountains, a deep loneliness etched into the lines of his back. He was dangerous, yes. He was the thunder and the lightning that had struck down her tormentor. But here, in the quiet of his sanctuary, he was something else too. He was a guardian. He hadn't asked her a single question. He hadn't demanded to know her name or her story. He had simply given her safety, food, and the space to heal. It was a debt she could never repay, and the weight of it was suffocating. She was no longer Cain's prisoner, but was she now his? A ward? A responsibility he would one day grow tired of? On the evening of the second day, a subtle shift occurred. Elias had prepared a simple meal of rabbit stew and was sitting at the table, eating from his tin plate. He had placed a bowl for her on a crate beside the cot, as he had done before. For an hour, it sat untouched. He finished his meal, cleaned his plate, and began to mend a tear in his leather saddlebag, the work of his hands, a way to quiet the noise in his head. Then he heard a sound, a faint scraping of a spoon against a bowl. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge it, knowing that to do so would be to frighten her back into her shell. But a knot of tension he hadn't realized he was holding began to loosen. She was eating. It was the first sign that the will to live was flickering back to life within her. When he finally did glance over, the bowl was empty. She was sitting up, the blanket still around her shoulders, but her eyes were no longer vacant. They were watching him, filled with a cautious curiosity. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the only communication that had passed between them in 48 hours. She hesitated, then slowly she swung her feet to the floor and stood up. She picked up her empty bowl and the one he had left on the table and walked to the wash basin in the corner. Her movements were stiff with pain, but they were deliberate. She was not his prisoner. She was not just a patient. By this one small act, she was claiming a piece of this space for herself. She was helping. He watched her, this fragile woman trying to impose order on a world that had shown her only chaos. He felt the last of his resistance crumble. The fear of what was to come was still there, a cold stone in his gut, but it was no longer a question of whether to keep her. He had crossed that line the moment he pulled the trigger. The question now was how to protect what he had saved. He had torn her from the jaws of one predator. Now he would have to stand between her and all the others that were surely coming. He had brought her to his sanctuary not to escape the world, but, he now realized, to make his final stand against it. His peace was gone, sacrificed for a stranger, and in the profound quiet of the cabin, he understood that he wouldn't have had it any other way. That was some heavy stuff. If you felt that tension, comment number 2, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. Every click helps our channel grow. Up next, the silence is broken, and the ghosts of the past finally begin to speak. The days that followed found a new rhythm. It was a fragile peace, built on unspoken words and shared tasks. The heavy silence of trauma began to recede, replaced by a softer quiet of coexistence. Ilara started to mend the rips in Elias's shirts, her stitches small and neat, an act of quiet gratitude. She would sweep the cabin's plank floor, the soft whisk of the broom, a gentle counterpoint to the ever-present wind whistling outside. She was claiming the space, not with words, but with actions. She was bringing a semblance of order to the chaos of their situation. For Elias, watching her was like watching a wildflower push its way through rock. He saw the resilience, the stubborn refusal to be completely broken, and it stirred something in him, a protective instinct that went deeper than the simple act of pulling a trigger. The physical bruises on her face began to fade, the angry purple softening to a sickly yellow-green, then disappearing altogether. Her split lip healed. But the healing of the skin only served to reveal the deeper wounds, the ones that lived behind her eyes. Sometimes, a sudden noise, a log shifting in the fire, the distant cry of a coyote would make her jump, her body instantly coiling with a fear that was sharp and raw. In those moments, Elias would see the ghost of Jedediah Cain in the room with them, his shadow falling long and dark over the tentative peace they had built. Elias knew that true healing couldn't begin until the story was told. The poison had to be drawn out. The encounter, when it came, was not born of questions. Elias never asked. He knew that demanding a story from someone who had been brutalized was just another form of violence. It happened on the 5th night. A storm had rolled in from the north, trapping them in the cabin. Rain lashed against the roof, and wind rattled the single window pane. Elias was cleaning his rifle by the fire, the familiar, methodical process a comfort to him. He worked in silence, the soft clicks of the metal parts, the only sound besides the storm. He felt her eyes on him. He had felt them many times, but this time was different. There was no fear in her gaze, only a heavy sadness. He finished his work, reassembling the rifle with practiced ease, and leaned it against the wall. He turned to face her. She was sitting on the edge of the cot, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The firelight flickered across her face, catching the unshed tears in her eyes. "My name is Ilara," she said. Her voice was a bare whisper, rough from disuse, but it cut through the sound of the storm. Elias simply nodded, waiting. He pulled the cabin's lone chair closer to the fire, but he didn't sit. He gave her the space. "The man knew," she swallowed, unable to say the word. "His name was Jedediah Cain." Another silence stretched between them. Elias just stood, a pillar of patience, letting her find her own way through the memory. "He wasn't a stranger," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "He worked for my uncle." The word uncle was spoken with such a venomous quiet that it held more menace than any shout. "After my parents, after they were gone, my uncle took everything, the ranch, the money. He took me in," he said it was his duty. But it wasn't a home, it was a cage. And Elias's face remained impassive, a mask of stone, but his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had seen this brand of evil before, the kind that cloaked itself in righteousness and family duty while it fed on the weak. He was a hard man, cruel. He believed a woman's place was to be silent and obedient. I was property, something he owned. Her eyes found his, and for the first time he saw not just fear, but a flicker of defiance. "I did not want to be owned. I made plans." I saved what little I could. I was going to go to Oregon, find a new life. She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. He found out. My uncle. He said he would teach me a lesson I would never forget, a lesson about what happens to ungrateful strays. She took a shuddering breath. He sent Cain to bring me back. He didn't just want me brought back. He wanted me broken, so I would never think of running again. That's what Cain was doing. He was teaching me my place. Each word was a hammer blow against the walls Elias had built around his heart. He saw it all with perfect clarity, the greedy uncle, the brutish enforcer, the young woman whose only crime was a desire for freedom. It was a story as old as the mountains, a tale of power and abuse that played out in 1,000 lonely places across the territory. And in her story, he heard the echoes of his own. He heard the voices of the past he had ridden so far to escape. The encounter he had dreaded was not with Cain's vengeful brothers. It was with this, the reflection of his own history in the eyes of a broken girl. He recognized the smug satisfaction in the eyes of a man like her uncle, the brutish pleasure of a man like Cain. He had seen it all before, and perhaps had not acted. Perhaps he had once been the man who looked away. That thought was a shard of ice in his gut. He finally moved, crossing the room in 2 long strides. He knelt before her, not in supplication, but so he could look her in the eye, so she wouldn't have to look up at him. He was no longer the towering, intimidating figure, but a man meeting her on her own level. He failed, Elias said, his voice low and raspy, but carrying an absolute conviction. He didn't break you. Her breath hitched, and a single tear finally escaped, tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. You're still here, he continued, his gaze unwavering. You fought. You survived. That makes you stronger than he ever was. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the tin bowl of stew she had left untouched. He stoked the fire, warming it again, and handed it back to her. It was a simple gesture, but it held a universe of meaning. It was an acknowledgement of her story. It was an acceptance of his role in it. He stood and walked to the window, peering out into the raging storm. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, but for the first time in a long time, the storm outside was no match for the one that had finally quieted inside him. He was no longer just a man who had killed another in a moment of anger. He was her shield. The promise he had made to himself when he first brought her here was no longer a reluctant burden. It was a purpose. It was an oath, sealed in blood and witnessed by the storm. He would be the wall that stood between Elara Vance and the darkness that sought to reclaim her. He would be the justice she had been denied. He would face down her past, because in doing so, he might finally be able to bury his own. He turned from the window, his expression set, his path clear. The encounter was over. The war had just begun. Justice and vengeance are 2 different things. If you agree, type number 3 in the comments. We're about to see a fragile peace take root, but in the Wild West, peace is often just the quiet before the storm. The storm broke with the dawn, washing the world clean. It left behind a sky of impossible blue and the scent of damp earth and pine. It was as if the mountain itself had taken a deep breath, and inside the cabin so had they. The confession, spoken into the heart of the storm, had not brought more darkness. Instead, it had lanced a wound, letting the poison out. The air between Elias and Elara was different now. The heavy, unspoken questions had been replaced by a shared, acknowledged truth. It was a truth built on violence and pain, but it was a foundation nonetheless. In the days that followed, a strange and quiet domesticity settled over the cabin. It was a life measured not in hours, but in small, meaningful tasks. Elias would rise before the sun, the scrape of his boots on the floor a familiar sound. He would stoke the embers of the fire back to life, put a pot of coffee on to boil, and then step out into the cold morning air to check his snares or chop wood. When he returned, he would find Elara awake. She no longer hid under the blanket, but would be sitting at the table, her hands busy with some small task. She began to take ownership of the inside of the cabin while he commanded the outside. She learned the quirks of his fireplace, how to coax the best heat from it. She found his meager supply of flour, and with a bit of jerky and wild onions, created a stew that was more than just sustenance. It was a meal. It was a small act of creation in a place that, until now, had only been about survival. Elias would watch her, his expression unreadable. He was a man who had stripped his life down to the studs, removing anything that wasn't essential. He had forgotten what it was like to share a space, to have his routine altered by the presence of another. At first, it had been a disruption. Now, it was becoming something else. He found himself listening for the soft sound of her movements in the morning. He noticed the way she mended a tear in his buckskin jacket, with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. He saw her stand at the cabin door, her face tilted up to the sun, a flicker of something other than fear in her eyes. It was a fragile, tentative peace, and it unnerved him as much as it soothed him. Peace was a luxury he had long since decided he couldn't afford. One afternoon, he returned from a hunt to find she had found a patch of wild daisies growing near the creek. A small tin cup holding a handful of the white and yellow flowers sat on the rough-hewn table. It was a splash of color, of life, in the stark, masculine space. It was so out of place that it was perfect. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at it. For the first time in years, the cabin felt less like a fortress and more like a home. The thought was so foreign, so dangerous, that he immediately pushed it away. But it lingered, like the scent of the flowers, subtle and persistent. That evening, as they sat by the fire, a small, genuine smile touched Ilara's lips for the first time. It was a fleeting thing, sparked by the way his big hunting dog, a silent grey beast named Ghost, had laid its head in her lap. The smile transformed her face. It erased the shadows and the pain, and for a heartbeat, Elias saw the woman she might have been, the woman she could still become. The sight hit him with the force of a physical blow, a sharp, unfamiliar ache in his chest. That smile became the light in his dark world. It was a light he realized he would kill to protect. But the past is a patient hunter. It does not tire. It does not forget. It simply waits for the right moment to strike. The moment came on a clear, cool afternoon, about 2 weeks after Ilara's arrival. The air was crisp, and the first hints of autumn were painting the aspen leaves gold on the higher slopes. Elias was skinning a rabbit outside, when Ghost suddenly lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elias went still, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. His eyes scanned the tree line. A minute later, a figure emerged, not from the main trail, but from a less traveled game path to the north. It was an old man, lean and wiry as a whip, with a face like a dried apple and a long grey beard. He carried a Hawken rifle with the comfortable ease of a man for whom it was a third arm. "Silas," Elias said, his voice flat. He relaxed his hand, but his body remained tense. Silas Croft was a trapper, one of the few other solitary men who scratched a living from these mountains. They weren't friends, but they had a mutual respect born of shared hardship and a common desire to be left alone. They might cross paths twice a year, share a bit of news, and then go their separate ways. For Silas to come directly to his cabin meant something. "Elias," the old man grunted, his eyes flicking from Elias to the cabin door and back again. "Heard you had some excitement down in the gulch a while back." The frontier had no secrets, only slow-moving news. Elias didn't bother to deny it. He just nodded, waiting. Silas spat a stream of tobacco juice. Word came up from the settlements. Man you put down was Jedediah Kane. Not a good man, but he had people. He paused, letting the weight of the word hang in the air. "Got 2 brothers, Caleb and Marcus, and they ain't the forgiving kind. They're the kind that salt the earth where their enemies fall." A cold dread seeped into Elias's bones. He had known this was a possibility, an abstract threat. Now it had a name. 2 names. "They were asking questions in town," Silas continued, his gaze steady. asking about the girl he was with, asking about any lone riders seen heading this way. Inside the cabin, Elias could hear a sudden silence. Ilara had been humming softly. The humming had stopped. She had heard. "Figured you ought to know," Silas said. He wasn't taking sides. He was delivering a fact as dispassionately as reporting a change in the weather. This was the code of the mountains. You warn a man when the wolves are coming. What he does after that is his own business. "I'm obliged, Silas," Elias said, his voice tight. The old trapper nodded once, turned without another word, and melted back into the trees, his visit as brief and ominous as a passing shadow. Elias stood motionless for a long time, the half-skinned rabbit forgotten at his feet. The fragile piece was gone, shattered into a million pieces. The beautiful, quiet world they had built inside the cabin was a fantasy. The real world was coming. It was riding horses and carrying guns, and it was filled with a vengeance as hot and unforgiving as the Montana sun. The candle of their quiet life had just been snuffed out by a cold wind from the past. The threat was no longer a distant possibility. It was on its way. A storm is coming. Do you think they should run or fight? Let me know by commenting. Number 4. If you want to see what happens next, show your support with a like, share, and subscribe. The decision they make next will change everything. The silence that followed Silas Croft's departure was heavier and more suffocating than any that had come before. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of men named Caleb and Marcus, a silence that hummed with the promise of violence. Elias stood outside, the bloody knife still in his hand, his knuckles white. He stared at the spot where the old trapper had vanished, but his mind was miles away, picturing 2 riders, their faces hard with hate, their saddlebags heavy with ammunition. He had lived with threats his entire life. He had run from them, fought them, and buried them. But this was different. This threat wasn't just aimed at him. It was aimed at the fragile light he had allowed into his life. It was aimed at her. He finally turned and walked back to the cabin, his steps heavy. He pushed the door open, expecting to see her huddled on the cot. The terror returned to her eyes. He expected to see the broken girl he had found in the dry gulch. The Ilara of the past would have been consumed by this news. She would have seen it as a confirmation that she was cursed, that misery would follow her no matter where she ran. Running was the only thing she had ever known. He braced himself for her fear, for the inevitable conversation about where she could go, how far she could get before they found her. But the woman standing in the center of the room was not the girl from the gulch. Ilara was standing by the table, her hands resting flat on the wood, as if drawing strength from it. Her face was pale, yes, but her eyes were not wide with terror. They were narrowed, burning with a fire he had never seen before. It wasn't the wild, panicked fire of a cornered animal. It was the steady, intense flame of a blacksmith's forge. She had heard every word Silas had said. He could see it in the rigid set of her shoulders. She was not broken. She was waiting. He closed the door behind him, the latch clicking into place with a sound of finality. "You heard," he stated. It wasn't a question. She nodded once, her gaze locked on his. "They're coming for me." They're coming for us," he corrected, his voice a low growl. The distinction was important. He would not let her carry this burden alone. He expected her to argue, to insist this was her fight, her curse to bear. Instead, she did something that completely upended his expectations. She pushed away from the table and walked toward him. She stopped just a few feet away, close enough that he could see the resolve hardening her features, chiseling away the last remnants of the victim she had once been. "I've been running my whole life," she said, her voice quiet but clear, without a single tremor. "From my uncle, from men like Cain. I ran because I thought that was the only way to survive. I thought freedom was somewhere else, a place over the next hill, across the next river." She took a deep breath, and it was the breath of a woman making a final, irrevocable choice. But I was wrong. She looked around the small, stark cabin. She looked at the stone fireplace she had learned to tend, at the neatly stacked wood, at the mended shirt folded on his cot. She looked at everything that had become the architecture of her unlikely salvation. "Freedom isn't a place you run to," she said, her eyes finding his again. "It's a place you make, a place you defend." Elias felt something shift inside him, a tectonic movement in the landscape of his soul. He had seen her as someone to be protected, a fragile thing to be shielded from the world. He had been wrong. She was not made of glass. She was forged from steel that had been through the fire and had come out harder. "I will not run from this," she declared, and the words were a vow spoken to him, to herself, and to the ghosts of the men who were coming. "I will not let them take this away. I will not let them turn me back into the girl they want me to be." She took another step, closing the distance between them. She reached out and for the first time touched him. Her hand rested on his forearm, her touch surprisingly firm. "This place, this is the first real home I have ever known." Her voice softened, but lost none of its intensity. "And you?" She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw not a plea for protection, but an offer of alliance. "You are the first man who has ever fought for me, instead of fighting to own me. I will not be the reason your home is destroyed. I will not be the weakness that gets you killed." Then she said the words that changed everything, the words that drew a line in the sand from which there would be no retreat. "I am not leaving," she said simply. "So they will have to come through me, and they will have to come through you." This was her transformation, the moment she rose from the ashes of her past. She was no longer Ilara Vance, the victim. She was no longer the girl being dragged by her hair. She was a woman standing her ground. She was a warrior choosing her battlefield. The fire in her eyes was not just defiance, it was a challenge to her enemies and a challenge to him. Elias looked down at her hand on his arm. He looked into her determined eyes. He had been prepared to fight a battle for her. But she was offering to fight a war with him. He had seen himself as her solitary guardian. But she saw them as partners, a family. The thought, which had once been so dangerous, now felt like the only truth that mattered. In her courage, he found his own renewed. The weariness of a lifetime of fighting fell away from him. He was no longer just protecting a stranger he had pitied. He was defending his home. He was defending the woman who had, against all odds, made it a home. A slow, grim smile touched his lips. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who has finally found a war worth fighting. "All right then," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Let them come. She's not a victim anymore. She's a fighter." If her courage just gave you chills, comment number 5 below. Now that they've chosen their ground, let's see how two people turn a simple cabin into a fortress against the coming darkness. The decision, once made, settled over the cabin like a heavy winter snow. It silenced all doubt, all fear, and left only the cold, hard reality of what needed to be done. There was no more waiting. There was only preparation. The confrontation they now faced was not with the men named Caleb and Marcus Kane. It was with the idea of them. It was a confrontation with the past itself, and they would not meet it unprepared. The cabin, once a simple shelter, was about to become a fortress. Their shared purpose became a silent, driving engine, transforming the quiet rhythm of their days into a focused, urgent hum of activity. Elias was a man who understood the geometry of a fight. He saw the angles, the weaknesses, the points of attack. He walked the perimeter of his small clearing, his eyes missing nothing. He saw the way the rocks offered cover, the way the thick pines could conceal an approach. He and Ilara spent the next day dragging fallen timber, not just for firewood, but for fortification. They reinforced the cabin's single door, bracing it with a heavy crossbeam. They boarded up half of the 2 small windows, leaving only narrow slits just wide enough for a rifle barrel. Each nail Elias hammered home was a punctuation mark on their declaration of defiance. This was their ground. It would not be given up easily. In the evenings, when the sun dipped below the peaks and plunged the valley into shadow, a different kind of preparation began. By the flickering light of the lantern, Elias brought out his tools for casting bullets. He melted lead in a small crucible over the fire, the molten metal glowing like a malevolent orange eye. He showed Elara how to pour it carefully into the molds, how to trim the excess, how to stack the finished rounds into neat, deadly pyramids on the table. She learned without a word, her movements careful and precise. The work was grim, a stark reminder of the violence they were inviting, but it was also empowering. Each bullet they made was a tangible piece of their resolve, a small, leaden promise that they would not be victims. Then came the most important lesson. One afternoon, Elias took his spare handgun, a Colt Peacemaker, from the locked wooden chest where he kept it. He laid it on the table between them. It was a heavy, beautiful, terrible thing. Elara stared at it, her expression a mixture of fear and fascination. It was an object that had only ever meant pain and terror to her. "You need to know how to use this," Elias said, his voice flat and businesslike. "Not to go looking for a fight, but to finish one if it comes to you." He took her out into the clearing, far enough from the cabin that a stray shot wouldn't damage their new fortifications. He showed her how to hold the weapon, how to brace her arm, how to line up the sights. The gun was heavy in her small hands, an unnatural weight. Her first shot went wide, the recoil jarring her shoulder, the loud report making her flinch. But she didn't drop it. She set her jaw, took a deep breath, and listened as he corrected her stance, his voice calm and steady in her ear. He was a patient teacher. He was teaching her not just the mechanics of the weapon, but the mentality behind it. "Don't think about the man," he told her, his voice low. "Think about the threat. You are not killing a person. You are ending a danger to your life. There's a difference." She listened. She practiced. Day after day, she would spend an hour in the clearing, the sharp crack of the pistol echoing through the mountains. Her flinch disappeared. Her aim steadied. She learned to load the weapon quickly, her fingers, once clumsy, now moving with a newfound dexterity. Elias watched, a quiet pride mixing with a profound sadness. He was proud of her strength, of her refusal to be helpless, but he hated that this was the skill she had to learn. He was teaching her the brutal language of his world, a language he had always wished he could forget. But in her growing confidence, he saw their chances of survival multiply. She was no longer a liability in a fight. She was becoming a partner. The true confrontation, during these days of preparation, was with themselves. They were facing down their own demons. For Elara, every bullet she cast, every shot she fired, was an act of defiance against the terrified girl she had been. She was reclaiming her own power, refusing to be defined by her fear. For Elias, every lesson he taught, every fortification he built, was an act of penance. He was confronting the solitary, selfish man he had become. He was building a wall not to keep the world out, but to protect the small world he had found within it. In the crucible of this shared purpose, something new was forged between them. The quiet respect had deepened into a powerful, unspoken bond. They moved around each other in the small cabin with a seamless grace, anticipating each other's needs. A shared glance across the dinner table could convey more than an hour of conversation. They had found a strange, profound peace in the heart of preparing for war. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat by the fire, the cabin silent except for the crackling flames. The pyramids of newly cast bullets gleamed on the table. The air was thick, with a tension that had nothing to do with the coming threat. Elias looked at Elara, her face illuminated by the firelight, her expression calm and resolute. He saw not just a survivor, but a woman of incredible strength and quiet grace. He saw his future. "Elara," he said, his voice rougher than usual. She looked up, her gaze meeting his. He didn't have pretty words. He wasn't a man for poetry or grand declarations. He spoke the only language he knew, plain, unvarnished truth. "This world, it's a hard place," he began, his voice low. "It takes more than it gives. Most days, just surviving is a victory. I've been surviving for a long time, alone." He paused, looking at their small fortress, at the life they had built in just a few short weeks. "I don't want to just survive anymore, and I don't want to be alone." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. Her fingers were calloused now, like his. "I don't have much to offer. Just this cabin, just my name, and a promise that I will stand between you and anything that tries to harm you until my last breath." He looked her straight in the eye. "Marry me, Elara." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming relief. She had come to this place as a refugee, a piece of human wreckage, and in this hard, lonely man, in this small, rugged cabin, she had found the one thing she had never believed she would: a home, a sanctuary, love. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Elias." Enflew. Their wedding had no church, no preacher, no witnesses save for the silent mountains and the listening stars. It was a simple vow, spoken into the quiet of the night, a promise made by two broken souls who had found a way to become whole together. It was the ultimate act of defiance. In the face of a coming storm, in the shadow of death, they chose life, they chose each other. Their small, fortified cabin had truly become a home, consecrated not by a holy book, but by a shared promise to fight for it, together. In the heart of preparing for war, they found love. If you believe in their cause, hit that like and share button, subscribe for more, and comment. Number 6. The enemy is at the gates. The final confrontation is about to begin. They did not have to wait long. The peace that followed their simple vows was a taut, fragile thing, a single moment of calm before the inevitable storm. 2 days later, under a sky the color of a bruised plum, they came. Elias saw them first. He was on the roof of the cabin, securing the final board over the stovepipe vent, when he caught the movement at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't the gentle sway of a deer or the rustle of a bear in the undergrowth. It was the deliberate, purposeful advance of men on horseback. 3 of them. They emerged from the deep shadows of the pines like wraiths, dark silhouettes against the dying light, their presence a poison that instantly soured the clean mountain air. He didn't shout. He didn't waste a single breath. He slid down from the roof, landing silently on the balls of his feet, and slipped inside the cabin. Elara was at the fireplace, her back to the door, but she felt his presence, the sudden chill that had entered with him. She turned, her eyes wide with a question he didn't need to hear. He simply tapped the rifle leaning against the wall, then pointed to the narrow slit of the western window. The time for preparation was over. The past had arrived. She didn't hesitate. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her hands were steady. She grabbed the spare rifle, a Winchester he had taught her to use, and moved to her position. She checked the load, her movements fluid, practiced. Elias took his own rifle, the one that felt like a part of his own arm, and moved to the slit by the door. Through the narrow opening, he watched them. They were fanning out, dismounting with a predatory confidence, leaving their horses tied loosely to the trees. They thought this would be easy. They thought they were coming to avenge their brother by punishing a lone man and the helpless woman he was hiding. They had come for the sheep, but they were about to find the wolves. One of them, a big man with a thick black beard, was clearly the leader. Caleb, Elias guessed. He stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Thorn!" he bellowed, his voice echoing unnaturally in the quiet clearing. "We know she's in there. We know what you did to our brother. Send the girl out, and we might let you live to see another sunrise." It was the empty promise of a bully, the kind of offer a man makes when he fully intends to kill you anyway. Elias remained silent. His silence was his answer. It was a language men like Caleb understood perfectly. It meant defiance. It meant death. Caleb's face hardened. He gave a curt nod to his companions. "Burn him out," he growled. One of the men unslung a canteen, but Elias knew it didn't hold water. He started moving toward the cabin, a lit match in his other hand. It was the oldest trick in the book, a coward's tactic. Elias lined up his sights. He did not think of the man's name, his family, or his life. He thought only of the threat. The man with the torch was a danger to his home, to his wife. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, and the roar of the shot was a declaration of war. The man with the torch stumbled, a look of pure shock on his face, before he pitched forward into the dirt, the flame of his match extinguished forever. All hell broke loose. The two remaining brothers dove for cover behind the rocks and trees, returning fire. Bullets slammed into the log walls of the cabin, the impact sounding like a giant, furious fist pounding on the door. Wood splintered. One shot whizzed through the window slit near Elias's head, close enough for him to feel the wind of its passage. He didn't flinch. He was in his element now. This was the brutal calculus he understood. "Ilara! The rocks to the left!" he yelled over the din. From her window, Ilara saw the second brother, Marcus, peering out from behind a large granite boulder. He was trying to get a clear shot at Elias's position. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she remembered Elias's words. Think about the threat. She rested the rifle barrel on the windowsill to steady it, took a breath just as he had taught her, and fired. Her shot went high, chipping a piece of granite just above the man's head. But it was enough. He yelped and ducked back behind cover, his confidence shaken. He hadn't expected to be taking fire from two directions. The fight settled into a deadly rhythm. The Kane brothers were pinned down, unable to advance. Elias and Ilara were trapped in their fortress, unable to leave. It was a stalemate, but time was on their side. Darkness was falling fast, and the mountain nights were cold. Elias knew that if they could hold out until dark, the advantage would be theirs. Caleb Kane was growing impatient. He was a man of action, not of strategy. He decided to force the issue. With a furious roar, he broke from cover, firing his pistol wildly as he charged directly at the cabin door. It was a brave move. It was a foolish move. Elias was ready for him. He tracked the man's charge, letting him get closer, letting his foolish courage seal his fate. But just as he was about to fire, Marcus broke cover from the other side, providing a distraction. It was a coordinated attack. Elias had a split-second choice to make. He swung his rifle toward Marcus, firing a quick shot that sent the man scrambling back to safety. But that split second was all Caleb needed. He reached the cabin, pressing himself flat against the wall, right under the firing slit. He was safe from Elias's rifle. "I'm coming for you, Thorn," Caleb roared, his voice muffled through the thick logs. Elias cursed. The man was too close. He couldn't get an angle on him. He could hear Caleb fumbling at the door, trying to break the latch. It was then that Ilara acted. She didn't scream, she didn't panic. She moved from the window, grabbing the heavy Colt peacemaker from the table. She knew what she had to do. The door was braced, but it wouldn't hold forever. She stood to the side of the door, the pistol held in both hands, aimed at the spot where the door would burst open. She could hear Caleb's grunts of effort, the splintering of wood as he threw his shoulder against it. Time seemed to slow down. She could hear her own heartbeat, a frantic drum against the sound of the assault. With a final, shattering crack, the crossbeam gave way, and the door flew open. Caleb Kane stumbled into the room, his face a mask of triumphant rage, his pistol raised. For a single, frozen moment, he met Ilara's eyes. He saw not the terrified girl he had imagined, but a woman with eyes of cold, hard steel. His triumph died, replaced by a flicker of disbelief. That flicker was the last thing he ever felt. Ilara pulled the trigger. The roar of the Colt inside the small cabin was deafening. Caleb was thrown backward, out the door he had just broken, his own final echo swallowed by the night. Outside, Marcus, seeing his brother fall, let out a cry of despair and rage. He fired one last wild shot into the darkness and then fled, crashing through the underbrush, the sound of his panicked retreat fading into the vast silence of the mountain. It was over. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the ringing in their ears and the ragged sound of their own breathing. The past had come for them, and it had been defeated. Elias moved to the doorway, rifle ready, and peered out into the darkness. He saw the body of Caleb Cain, a dark shape on the ground. He saw the still form of the first brother near the tree line. He listened for any sound of the third, but there was only the wind. They were alone again. He turned back inside. Ilara was still standing where she had been, the heavy pistol hanging limply at her side. She was staring at the broken door, her face pale in the firelight. He walked to her and gently took the gun from her hand, setting it on the table. He then wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. She buried her face in his chest, and her body began to shake, the reaction she had held back for so long, finally overwhelming her. He just held her, stroking her hair, letting her release the terror and the triumph. When her shaking finally subsided, she looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It's over," he said softly. "It's truly over." "No," she whispered, a small, tremulous smile touching her lips. "It's just beginning." She placed his hand on her stomach. "Elias, I'm with child." He froze, his mind struggling to comprehend her words over the adrenaline and the smell of gunpowder. A child, a new life, conceived in their fragile peace and defended in a crucible of violence. It was the ultimate victory. It wasn't just survival. It was creation. It was the future, rising from the ashes of a bloody, brutal past. Life, defiant and unyielding, had won. The past has been defeated, and a new life is on the horizon. What an incredible climax. Comment number 7, if your heart is still pounding. Now, let's see how this act of violence and love shapes the future for our unlikely family. The night of the battle was the last night the cabin ever felt like a fortress. The following morning, as the sun crested the eastern peaks and poured golden light into the valley, Elias Thorne kicked the broken door off its last hinge and let it fall to the ground. He stood in the opening, breathing in the clean, cold air, and felt a profound shift in the world. The ghosts were gone. The echoes of the past had finally fallen silent. He was not a man hiding from the world anymore. He was a man standing on the threshold of his own life. He spent the next week building a new door. It was a sturdy thing, made of thick pine, but he built it without firing slits or heavy crossbeams. It was a door meant to welcome, not to repel. As he worked, Ilara began the slow process of reclaiming their home from the violence that had scarred it. She scrubbed the floors clean of the gunpowder haze, patched the bullet holes in the walls with a mixture of clay and moss, and replaced the shattered window pane with a piece of oiled parchment that let in a soft, milky light. They didn't speak of the fight. They didn't need to. Their shared work was a silent conversation, a mutual agreement to build a future on top of the ground where they had buried the past. The bodies of the Cain brothers were gone. Elias had taken them deep into the mountains, giving them a rough burial in a place where no one would ever find them. It wasn't an act of reverence, but of finality. He was closing a chapter, not just for Ilara, but for himself. He was burying the man he used to be, the man who believed that violence was the only answer. As the months passed, the rhythm of their lives changed again. It was no longer the tense, watchful rhythm of soldiers preparing for a siege. It became the slow, steady, and purposeful rhythm of a family. Ilara's belly grew, a visible promise of the new life to come. The change in her was profound. The last traces of fear were replaced by a fierce, maternal glow. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a creator. Elias watched her with a quiet awe. This woman, who had been through the deepest hell, was now the source of the greatest hope he had ever known. He changed, too. The hard edges of his solitude began to soften. The grim silence that had been his constant companion was replaced by the low murmur of his voice as he spoke to the child growing in Ilara's womb. He would tell it stories of the mountains, of the hawk that circled the peaks, of the strength of the ancient pines. He found himself smiling more, small, genuine smiles that reached his eyes. The lonely ghost of the mountains was becoming a husband, a father. Their son was born in the spring, when the valley was exploding with new life. They named him Samuel. He was a strong, healthy baby with his mother's dark hair and his father's steady grey eyes. Holding his son for the first time, Elias felt a love so powerful, so overwhelming, that it shook him to his core. It was a love that was terrifying in its intensity, because now he had everything to lose. But it was also a love that gave him a strength he had never known. It was the strength of creation, not of destruction. Years melted into one another like seasons in the valley. The Thorn Ranch, as it came to be known, grew. The small cabin became the heart of a larger home, with new rooms added on, built by Elias's own hands. A small barn went up, then corrals. They raised a few cattle, kept chickens, and planted a garden that Ilara tended with a loving hand. Another child came, a daughter they named Hope, a girl with her mother's quiet resilience and her father's fierce spirit. The sound of children's laughter echoed in the valley, a sound that had been absent for generations. It was the sound of life, vibrant and triumphant. Elias Thorn was no longer a myth or a ghost. He was a family man, known in the distant settlements as a straight shooter and a fair dealer, a man who kept to himself but whose word was his bond. Ilara was the heart of their home, a woman of quiet strength and deep compassion. She taught her children to be kind, but also to be strong. She taught them to read and write, but she also taught them the language of the mountains, the names of the flowers, the tracks of the animals. She taught them about courage, not the courage of a gun, but the courage to stand up for what is right, to defend the weak, to build a life of purpose and love in a world that was often hard and unforgiving. Sometimes, on a quiet evening, Elias and Ilara would sit on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the sky. They would watch their children playing in the yard, their laughter the sweetest music they had ever heard. In those moments, the memory of the violence that had brought them together would feel like a story from another lifetime, a dark and bloody fairy tale that had, against all odds, ended in peace. Their story became a quiet legend in the territory. It wasn't a tale told loudly in saloons, but a story whispered around campfires, a reminder that the West wasn't just about outlaws and gunfights. It was about survival, redemption, and the extraordinary courage of ordinary people. It was a story that proved that even in the darkest, most violent corners of the world, a single act of justice, a single choice to stand and fight instead of run, could change everything. It was a testament to the fact that a home is not just a place you find. It is a fortress you build, a sanctuary you defend, and a future you create together. And on their small patch of land, under the watchful gaze of the Montana mountains, Elias and Ilara Thorn had built a place where the sun would always rise. From a bloody gulch to a family home. What an incredible journey. For the final time, comment number 8 to let us know you made it to the end. If you loved this story, make sure you're subscribed, because we have so many more tales of courage and redemption from the Old West waiting for you. Click on the video on your screen right now for another story you won't want to miss. As we come to the end of Elias and Ilara's story, I can't help but reflect on what it truly means. On the surface, it's a thrilling tale from the Old West, full of grit, guns, and justice. But if you look deeper, beneath the dust and the gunpowder, there's a powerful lesson for all of us, right here, right now, in our own lives. For me, this story isn't just about a cowboy saving a damsel in distress. It's about the profound, life-altering power of choosing to intervene. Elias Thorn was a man who had built a fortress of solitude around his heart. He wanted to be left alone, to disconnect from the pain of the world. How many of us feel that way sometimes? We see injustice. We see suffering, maybe not as dramatic as a scene from a Western, but we see it in our communities, in our workplaces, even in our own families, and the easiest thing to do is to look away. We tell ourselves it's not our problem, that getting involved is too risky, too complicated. But Elias's story challenges that instinct. His single decisive act of intervention didn't just save Ilara's life, it saved his own. It shattered the walls of his apathy and forced him to reconnect with his own humanity. It gave him a purpose beyond mere survival. And then there's Ilara. Her transformation is a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. She begins as a victim, a person defined entirely by the horrible things that have been done to her. But she doesn't stay that way. She takes the safety she is given and uses it not to hide, but to heal. She learns to stand, to fight, and ultimately, to love. Her journey reminds me that our past doesn't have to be a prison. Our scars don't have to define our future. We all have the capacity to rise from the ashes of our own personal battles, to take control of our narrative, and to become the authors of our own lives. It's about making a choice, the choice to stop running and to start building, to defend the small patch of peace and happiness we carve out for ourselves, no matter how hard the world tries to take it away. Ultimately, their story together is a lesson in partnership. Two broken, lonely people found in each other not a solution to their problems, but a partner to face those problems with. They didn't fix each other. They stood beside each other and fought back to back. They built their fortress together, bullet by bullet, nail by nail. In our own lives, the most powerful fortresses we can build are the relationships we forge based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the unwavering promise to stand with someone, not just when it's easy, but when the world comes knocking at the door. It's a reminder that courage isn't always a solitary act. Sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is to let someone in, to trust them with our broken pieces, and to build something stronger, together. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. If this story and its lessons resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves a powerful tale from the Old West. We have many more stories of courage, conflict, and redemption waiting for you. Click on the video you see on your screen now to dive into another unforgettable adventure. Until next time, stand your ground and protect your peace.